final part of the videos, we'll talk about how you actually make performance assessments align with your objectives. And there are 6 steps. 1. Identify your goals. We've been talking about this for a while. It's hard to do, especially when you're really trying to figure out what in the world the point of all this stuff is in some content areas. Again, math is pretty easy and straightforward. Language arts actually can be pretty easy too. When you get to science and social studies, it's a whole different ballgame. Second thing, create a framework based on your goals and sub-goals, kind of what we did for the past 2 assignments, right, where you are identifying your objectives and then creating a paper and pencil assessment aligned to those goals. 3, clarify the cognitive process involved, making sure you know what students have to think about or do cognitively in order to succeed, which leads to 4, figuring out what success is actually going to look like. What do I want my students to really be able to do? 5, sketch and refine some tasks for the goals and sub-goals, meaning that I need to then, once I figure out what's involved and what good enough is, and how am I going to get them to do that? And then 6, create my descriptions and my rubric scoring guide. So, step 1, identifying your goals. Again, here's an example based on that science material we've talked about so far with interaction, succession, and conservation. For lesson 2, let's say these are my lesson goals. All right, students will explain how human caused and natural events can cause succession in an ecosystem. Students will be able to recall characteristics of primary and secondary succession. If you think about the material, that's in there. Students will also be able to describe many different human events and natural events that lead to succession. So we have a bunch of different human things and a bunch of different natural things. Now, I want them to be able to do both. The human is really essential because that leads to the next lesson all about conservation. But natural disasters are also important. If I decide I have to make a cut, I'll go with the human-caused problems rather than the natural ones. But I'd like to keep both. Finally, last part, students will be able to apply definitions of climax, community, invasive species, and extinction to these changes that they're seeing in an ecosystem. So, again, this overall lesson goal is not just the sum of these parts, but it's figuring out how all these parts tie together, right? Some human things will lead to primary, some will lead to secondary succession. Strip mining, for example, leads to primary, right? Deforestation leads to secondary. Similarly, I want them to be able to see that different types of natural events lead to primary or secondary. Volcanic eruptions, right, where you have literally new earth being made, leads to primary. Most of other things like floods and droughts and fires lead to secondary. Similarly, right, the ideas of climax, community, invasive species, and extinction should all be tied to the different human and natural causes. In other words, what happens when we obtain a climax community? And this is what really we want as people, right? All the people who want to have non-invasive plant species in Wisconsin, they want it to be a climax community. We don't want new stuff, right? And we want to keep all the stuff we have. We don't want any extinction, right? We don't want to lose the brown trout, or we don't want to lose the prairie dogs or whatever else we care about, right? And so when we think about how these things relate to each other and how they lead to succession or keep succession from happening, we see how all these different parts fit together. And now that means at the end of the day, what I want my students to be able to do is, if I give them different types of events, human caused and natural caused, I want them to tell me what that means. I want them to incorporate the ideas of climax communities, invasive species, and extinction, and talk about whether or not it leads to primary or secondary succession. right? And again, this is the heavy lifting part where you have to dig into the content and figure out what is the point, right? Now, if we went one step back and we talked about the whole unit, right, then it's a different point. But for this lesson, this is the point of the day. This is what I want them to take home with them at the end. Step 2 then, creating a framework. Super easy once I make my goals, because my framework is just my goal structure, right? Super easy. Could do this in your sleep. Step 3 is a little more complicated. I need to think about, well, what are the different cognitive processes that actually go into this thing, right? So if I start with my sub-goals and I say that, well, students describe the different types of succession and their characteristics, well, students will have to remember some basic characteristics of primary and secondary succession, and also something about how fast succession typically occurs in either case. And again, it is pretty simple stuff. Second one, describing human and natural causes of succession, right? This is going to be up to me to teach them different kinds or to teach them how to look at new kinds. But I would probably pick 3 of each, right? 3 humans, things like pollution, deforestation, and maybe some kind of more specific thing of mining or water management or something like that, that would give me a lot of mileage. And then I'd probably have 3 natural ones: volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods, whether it's hurricanes or excess river water, whatever. But I'd probably want to stick with that so they have enough background knowledge that they can do it. Finally then, I want them to have a good understanding of these different terms and be able to apply them to different ecosystems and different changes that they see in ecosystems. Finally then, when I think about, well, what does it mean to think about how succession occurs in an ecosystem, right? I am thinking back to my original goal here, where I'm trying to get them to integrate all these things, right? So when I say that I want them to describe how succession occurs, they need to be able to look at an ecosystem with different relationships and figure out how changes in one area are going to affect changes in other areas. The changes, of course, will be human causes or natural causes. And they will need to talk about then, will something go extinct? Will things become stable? Is this an instance of an invasive species, plant or animal? And what type of, how fast will this change occur? Will it be fast or slow? So as I think through that, my next step is thinking about, what is success going to look like? So in order for a student to demonstrate, right, that they get this primary, secondary succession, I have to accurately describe the type of succession that's occurring and make a judgment about how quickly it will occur, right? Is it going to be fast? Is it going to be slow? I could frame it and get more specific or more detailed and say, what is this going to look like in a year? What's this going to look like in 5 years? What about 10 years, right? Similarly, I can go through each one of my other sub-goals and get a little more detailed about exactly what I need them to do to demonstrate success. Again, success for the overall lesson means that they not only have mastered the sub-goals independently, but they've also managed to integrate them in the overall lesson goal.